Hi, I'm Sarah, and I'm 25. Let me tell you something that still burns every time I try to forget it. My rich aunt left me everything, a big house and $5 million, but those two people, those ghosts who call themselves my parents, who abandoned me 15 years ago, suddenly showed up at the will reading. Before I tell you what happened when my lawyer walked in and wiped the smirk right off their faces, please like, subscribe, and comment below where you are watching from. I need to know I'm not alone in this twisted story. I need to know someone else sees the utter injustice of it. 15 years. Do you know what 15 years of absence feels like? It's not just a blank space. It's a gaping, infected wound. It's waking up every single day, knowing that the two people biologically wired to protect you chose not to. I was 10 years old. 10. A child. I remember that day not in colors, but in shades of gray and the bitter taste of unshed tears. They didn't even have the decency to yell or fight. They just left a note. A small, cowardly, folded piece of paper on the kitchen counter next to a stale piece of toast. It said they couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. Responsibility? I was their daughter, not a faulty appliance they could trade in. 15 years of birthdays spent staring at the phone, waiting for a call that never came. 15 years of school events, graduations, and moments that should have been shared. But I was always standing alone, always watching the other kids get embraced by their real families. Every time I filled out a medical form, I had to write N, A, or unknown for their contact information. A constant, stinging reminder that they had actively erased themselves from my life. That is the depth of the pain I carried. That is the raw, burning resentment that fueled every single decision I made since I became an adult. And they had the nerve, the sickening, unbelievable audacity, to reappear when the only thing they could smell was money. They didn't come back for me, Sarah. They came back for the digits, for the inheritance, for the big house and the life that my aunt, the only decent soul in my bloodline, had finally given me. I hate them. I hate them for the past, and I hate them even more for trying to steal my future. I will never forgive them for reducing my life to a financial burden they dumped and then tried to reclaim like a lost wallet. My Aunt Clara was everything they were not. They were cold, she was warmth. They were absent, she was present. They were selfish, she was sacrifice. She wasn't just my rich aunt, she was my savior. After they left, the state shuffled me around for a few months, a terrifying blur of strange beds and judgmental eyes before Aunt Clara, my mother's older sister, managed to cut through the red tape. She wasn't wealthy then, not really. She was a fighter. But she took me in, and she gave me stability, even if it was just a tiny, 2-bedroom apartment, full of hand-me-down furniture. She worked tirelessly, building her business from the ground up, sacrificing her own youth and relationships just so I could have a safe place to land. She put me through college. She taught me what unconditional love looked like, something those two monsters couldn't grasp if it were tattooed on their palms. The $5 million? The sprawling, incredible house? That wasn't just money. That was her lifetime of hard work, poured into a vessel of security for me. She told me once, before she got sick, "Sarah, money can't buy happiness, but it can buy you a fence so tall that no one can ever hurt you again." That inheritance was that fence. It was freedom. It was the ability to finally breathe without the suffocating fear of being homeless or alone again. When the primary attorney, Mr. Davies, read the key clause of her will, I felt my heart stop. To my beloved niece, Sarah Thompson, I leave the entirety of my estate, including my primary residence, and all financial holdings, estimated at $5 million, free and clear. The words echoed in the mahogany-paneled room, so heavy with love and so heavy with responsibility. The money was a symbol. It was Aunt Clara's final definitive statement. I choose you. You are worthy. And I sat there, tears streaming down my face, feeling the warmth of her legacy, thinking that finally, the pain of the past could be walled off. But the world never lets a victim have peace, does it? The universe must have sent an engraved invitation to the reading addressed to greed and hypocrisy, because that's when the doors opened. That's when they walked in. And the burning hatred I thought I had buried 15 years ago reignited into an inferno. The air changed instantly. It turned icy, toxic. Before they even fully entered the room, I knew. That distinctive, cloying scent of cheap cologne and expensive entitlement wafted in first, followed by the sight of them. I hadn't seen them since. That morning since they left me the note, but time hadn't changed their inherent nature. only their clothing. They were dressed in cheap attempts at wealth, ill-fitting suits and a dress that screamed, "On loan." It was insulting. If they were truly successful or happy, they wouldn't need to be here, crawling out of the woodwork like cockroaches for a handout. The reading was paused. Mr. Davies, an old-school lawyer who seemed perpetually disappointed in human nature, paused mid-sentence and adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. I, however, was a portrait of raw, unadulterated shock and pain. My breath hitched, a strangled animal sound that seemed to fill the silent room. I felt every single moment of those 15 years rush back the loneliness, the confusion, the grinding poverty Aunt Clara fought to save me from. And now, they stood there, tall and smiling, as if this were a pleasant surprise, a family reunion. No apologies, no whispered words of regret, just those, predatory, calculating eyes sweeping the room, calculating the distance between the front door and the stack of legal documents that guaranteed my fortune. They were here for the $5 million, not for their daughter, Sarah. They had clearly run the numbers. Daughter plus inheritance equals early retirement. They saw me not as a human being they traumatized, but as an asset, a living, breathing piggy bank they had the legal right to smash open. The fact that they could stand there, physically embodying the betrayal I'd suffered, and yet wear those sickeningly smug expressions, was an act of psychological violence. My hands were shaking so hard I had to press them into my thighs just to keep still. I didn't want them to see my vulnerability. I didn't want them to think they still had any power over me. But the fear was there, a sharp spike of terror. Could they actually take this away? Could they finish the job they started 15 years ago and leave me with nothing again? The pain of the past was now threatening to consume the hope of the future. I gripped the armrest of the chair, leaving a damp impression, and waited for the inevitable venom to spill from their lips. The silence, after they entered, was the worst kind of scream. It lasted only a few seconds, but in my head, it stretched into an eternity. Then, my mother, the one who supposedly carried me for 9 months, spoke, and her voice, smooth and practiced, dripped with saccharine falsehood. "Sarah, darling, it's been too long." Darling? The word tasted like ash in my mouth. She didn't approach me. She spoke directly to Mr. Davies, the lawyer, cutting me out of the transaction entirely, treating me like a piece of furniture they were arguing over. My father then stepped forward, puffing up his chest. He looked exactly the same, perpetually self-important, completely devoid of empathy. This is the moment where the full, blazing insult was thrown directly in my face. He didn't waste time on pleasantries or fake reconciliation. He went straight for the jugular, eyes locked on the will document. "We're your guardians," he announced, loudly, proudly, that awful entitled smile plastered across his face. "We received notice that our daughter was named sole beneficiary. As her legal custodians, even if she is technically of age, we have a responsibility to manage this estate for her." His smile was sickening. It was triumphant. It was the face of a vulture who thought he had just stumbled upon a massive, forgotten carcass. Technically of age? I was 25. I owned my own successful digital marketing firm that Aunt Clara had helped me start. They were using the term guardians as a legal weapon, hoping that the state's failure to fully recognize my autonomy would hand them control of $5 million. I felt a volcanic eruption of fury. They abandoned me, vanished into thin air, signed away their rights, yet here they were, invoking the sacred title of guardian only, when it promised wealth. The hypocrisy was so vast it was physically painful. I wanted to leap across the table and physically rip that smile from his face. I wanted to scream, "You forfeited that title the moment you left me, with nothing but a note and a memory of betrayal." But I held back. I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth would shatter. I knew if I spoke, I would give them the confrontation they wanted. The drama they could twist into a narrative of the ungrateful child. I needed to be silent. I needed to let my real champion fight this battle. I looked across the room, past the stunned faces of the other distant relatives who were now realizing they wouldn't be getting a piece of the pie, and I locked eyes with my own lawyer. Not the one reading the will, but my lawyer. I had him on standby outside the firm, knowing these two sewer rats might show up. Mr. Davies, the will's executor, had gone silent after their claim. The room felt like a pressure cooker. My parents, emboldened by the lack of immediate resistance, started making demands. "We'll need to see the account statements," my mother chirped, pulling a cheap, oversized notebook out of her equally cheap handbag. "We'll need to list the house immediately. Sarah doesn't need all that space. It's fiscally irresponsible." My blood turned to ice. They were already spending it in their minds. They weren't fighting for custody. They were fighting for control of the assets. They were erasing my aunt's gift and replacing it with their same, awful, toxic control. My only hope, the only thing keeping me from dissolving into a 10-year-old mess again, was the man standing discreetly by the entrance. Mr. Sterling. Unlike my father's cheap suit, Mr. Sterling's attire was quiet power. He was a stone wall, unmoving and absolutely focused. When I met his eyes just for a split second across the horrifying tableau of the will reading, he gave the smallest, most infinitesimal nod. It was a silent promise. A guarantee. It said, "I've got this. Your pain is noted, and their arrogance is about to be demolished." That nod was the most comforting, powerful thing I had felt in months. It gave me the strength to remain absolutely silent, letting them dig their own greedy graves deeper. The silence I maintained was not compliance. It was a loaded weapon. I was letting them present their case, letting them lay out their full, arrogant claim, knowing that Mr. Sterling was about to systematically tear it all down, piece by agonizing piece. The thought of that moment, of watching their smug masks crack, was the only thing that kept the raw, burning rage inside me from exploding into tears. I wanted them to suffer the public humiliation they deserved. I wanted them to realize their monumental mistake in abandoning a child who was destined to inherit everything. They continued to parade their false parental concern, and the sheer volume of their lies was dizzying. My mother started, rambling about missed opportunities and how they'd always loved me from afar, but they were simply overwhelmed by corporate responsibilities. Corporate responsibilities? They drove a beat-up sedan and hadn't held a steady job between them for 5 years, according to the private investigator Mr. Sterling had hired months ago, just in case. They were weaving a tapestry of fiction, trying to paint themselves as tragic, loving parents who were merely victims of circumstance. The lies were a deep, cutting insult to Aunt Clara's memory and to my own suffering. Every word was a stab in the 15-year-old wound. My father took out his phone and started scrolling through pictures of houses on Zillow, already mentally selecting his new vacation home with my money. "We need to set up a trust fund immediately," he dictated to the stunned Mr. Davies. "Sarah is far too young to manage this kind of wealth. We have decades of financial experience. Decades of experience in running up debt, maybe." I knew Mr. Sterling, standing sentinel near the door, was listening to every word, cataloging every lie, every arrogant assumption. He was letting the rope spool out, giving them just enough slack to hang themselves completely. The tension in my chest was so tight it felt like a steel vice was crushing my lungs. I wanted to correct them, to expose their whole bankrupt history. But Mr. Sterling's instruction had been clear. Silence is your weapon. Let them commit to the fraud. They spoke for almost 10 minutes, painting a detailed picture of how they, the responsible guardians, would seize and manage the $5 million. They talked about renovations, investment portfolios, and a modest allowance for me, their daughter, the actual beneficiary. My mother even had the gall to suggest they move into the house, temporarily, to oversee the transition. They were so consumed by their own greed and their assumed victory that they failed to see the danger. They failed to notice Mr. Sterling slowly pushing off the doorframe, taking 2 quiet, purposeful steps into the room. They didn't see the silent, cold fury in my eyes. They only saw the number, $5 million, and they were about to realize that the number belonged to someone they abandoned and couldn't reclaim. The tension was suffocating. My mother was mid-sentence, discussing which private school she would like to enroll me in, 25 years old. Remember? When Mr. Sterling finally moved. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply the sound of a leather briefcase being set down gently on the marble floor that made the entire room flinch. The sound cut through my mother's rambling about Sarah's future education, like a blade. All eyes snapped to him. He didn't look at me or the executor. He looked straight at my parents, and his expression was utterly devoid of human emotion. It was the look of a highly trained surgeon about to perform a necessary, precise amputation. "Pardon me," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a density that commanded attention. It was instantly clear he was in charge. My parents looked annoyed, as if a servant had interrupted their important business transaction. "And who might you be?" my father scoffed, crossing his arms. "Mr. Sterling didn't answer that question. He didn't introduce himself. He simply walked to the table, opened his briefcase, and pulled out two crisp, official-looking documents. He placed one directly in front of my father, and the other in front of my mother. He didn't touch the will, and he didn't even look at me. His entire focus was the utter annihilation of their fraudulent claim. The sheer anticipation of the next few seconds was almost too much to bear. The relief of no longer having to be silent, the knowledge that my protector was finally stepping into the arena, made the adrenaline surge through my veins. This wasn't just a legal maneuver. This was retribution. This was the moment I had waited 15 years for. It wasn't me screaming at them, which they could ignore. It was the law itself, delivered by a man with zero tolerance for their lies, that was about to scream at them. I watched my father's expression shift from annoyance to confusion as he picked up the paper. He didn't understand the jargon yet, but he knew the font, the seals, the weight of the paper. It was official. It was real. And it meant danger to their $5 million daydream. My father began reading the document, his brow furrowing deeper and deeper. My mother, leaning over his shoulder, let out a small, sharp gasp. "Mr." Sterling stood back, hands folded neatly in front of him, allowing them the full, excruciating minute it took to process the cold, hard, legal truth. The document was a copy of my legal emancipation papers, filed and granted 5 years prior, explicitly severing all legal and financial ties with my biological parents. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a legal declaration that they had lost me forever, years before the money was even in play. The papers stated, with chilling clarity, that any claim of guardianship, fiduciary duty, or parental right was null and void. The first crack appeared in their masks. The triumphant smile my father wore had evaporated, replaced by a look of bewildered, wounded arrogance. He slammed the paper onto the table. "This is ridiculous," he stammered, his voice suddenly losing its booming authority and becoming a reedy, pathetic squeak. "This is tampering. She can't do this. We never signed off on this." My mother started hyperventilating, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You little liar. You planned this. You stole the legal rights we were going to exercise." "Stole their rights?" "They threw their rights away like garbage on the side of the road." The fury I felt was exhilarating. They weren't angry about losing their daughter. They were angry about losing their $5 million lottery ticket. They were desperate, exposed, and starting to sweat. Mr. Sterling then spoke again, his voice cutting through their hysteria. "The court found substantial evidence of parental abandonment and failure to provide support. The documentation is all present, signed by a judge. The emancipation is valid and final." He then pointed to a clause in the will that they hadn't gotten to yet. A clause Aunt Clara had placed there like a final, brilliant dagger. It read that the estate was only to be administered to Sarah, not to any individual with outstanding claims of parental or custodial responsibility, a clear, loving shield against their eventual, predictable greed. My parents were legally, financially, and emotionally blocked. The $5 million was mine, fenced in by Aunt Clara's foresight and Mr. Sterling's impeccable legal preparation. The truth was a blunt weapon, and it had landed square on their faces. My father tried to rally, attempting to regain his authority with a blustering display. "This emancipation is irrelevant. She is still our child. We will challenge this. We will drag this through every court in the state. We have family rights." He was spitting the words out, his face contorted in a terrifying mix of rage and panic. He was realizing the gravity of the situation. Not only were they losing the money, but they were being publicly exposed for the monsters they were. Mr. Sterling was ready for this, too. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned in, his gaze unflinching. "You are welcome to challenge, sir," Mr. Sterling replied coolly. "But be advised that my client's petition for emancipation included a complete, detailed chronology of your non-contact, financial neglect, and failure to provide medical and educational support over the last 15 years. That evidence, documented by private investigators and social services, is damning. Furthermore, your attempt to suddenly exert guardianship over a 5-year-old woman solely for the purpose of controlling a multi-million-dollar estate will be presented in court as an act of fraud. You will not only lose the challenge, but you will open yourselves up to civil litigation for retroactive child support and emotional distress. Think very carefully, before you spend your remaining funds on legal fees, if you truly want those details made public." That was the final nail. The word litigation and the threat of their dirty laundry being aired for the public, detailing their years of failure, instantly broke them. My mother, who had been weeping theatrically, instantly stopped. She looked at my father, and the silent panic in her eyes confirmed their retreat. They weren't willing to risk exposure or actual financial damage for a chance at a long shot. They were cowards. Always had been. The room was silent once more, but this time, it was a silence of defeat, not anticipation. Mr. Sterling hadn't just won. He had delivered a preemptive, total surrender. The humiliation was so complete, so perfectly executed, that all I could do was stare at them with cold, satisfying contempt. The $5 million was safe, but the justice of watching them crumble under the weight of their own failed greed was priceless. That was the exact moment, the one I will carry with me forever. Sweeter than any victory. When my father fully processed the triple threat, the ironclad will, the emancipation papers, and the threat of civil litigation, his face didn't just fall, it collapsed. The blood drained completely, starting from his high forehead and pooling down to his chin, leaving his skin a sickly, shocking shade of white. My mother followed suit. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving the expensive makeup looking garish and misplaced. They turned pale, not just surprised, not just disappointed, they turned the color of death, the color of total, utter defeat. The arrogance, the smug confidence, the sickening, predatory smiles they had worn just moments before, shattered like cheap glass. They looked small. They looked pathetic. They looked exactly like the failures they were. It was physical proof of the emotional devastation they were experiencing, and it was glorious. I finally broke my silence, but I didn't scream or yell. I just spoke 2 words, my voice low and steady, aimed directly at my father. Get out. My voice was so calm, so utterly lacking in emotion, that it carried more weight than any outburst. My father stammered, trying to formulate a final threat, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at the paperwork, then at Mr. Sterling, then at me. He saw no weakness, only an impenetrable wall of legal preparation and righteous fury. He realized, in that awful, agonizing moment, that he hadn't just been outmaneuvered. He had been anticipated. Aunt Clara and Mr. Sterling had built this legal fortress, knowing he would try to claw his way in. He was defeated by the foresight of the woman who truly loved me. He grabbed my mother's arm, the arm that was now trembling violently, and they stumbled toward the door. They didn't look at me again. They didn't apologize. They didn't even say goodbye. They simply retreated, 2 pathetic, humiliated figures disappearing into the hallway, chased out by the magnitude of their own failure. It was the perfect, silent closing of the chapter they opened 15 years ago. The sound of the door clicking shut behind them was like the sound of a jail cell slamming closed on my past. It was over. The room, which had been vibrating with toxic tension, suddenly became silent and calm. Mr. Davies, the executor, cleared his throat and quietly finished reading the final clauses of the will. But the details hardly registered. The battle had been fought and won in the interruption. I looked at Mr. Sterling, and for the first time, a small, knowing smile appeared on his usually stern face. He didn't need to say anything. The look was enough. It was a shared moment of vindication, a silent acknowledgement of the justice served. My body, which had been locked in a rigid state of fear and anger for the last half hour, finally started to relax, and I realized how profoundly exhausted I was. I felt an incredible weight lifting off my shoulders, not just the weight of the $5 million that was now indisputably mine, but the emotional burden of the what if. What if they had won? What if they had managed to seize control? I would have been trapped, forced to constantly fight them for access to the life Aunt Clara intended for me. The inheritance would have become a source of endless legal misery, not the freedom it was meant to be. But the fear was gone. The fence Aunt Clara had promised was built, and it was impenetrable. I stood up, feeling shaky but taller than I ever had before. I walked over to Mr. Sterling, and all I could manage was a whispered, "Thank you." He simply nodded again. "Your aunt was a remarkably intelligent woman, Sarah. She anticipated everything. This was her final gift to you, peace." He handed me the envelope containing the deeds and the account numbers. It was heavy, tangible proof that I had won. But the true victory wasn't the weight of the paper. It was the lightness in my heart, the absence of their awful presence. They had abandoned me once. Now, I had abandoned them, legally and permanently, taking everything they desperately wanted with me. The pain of the past would always be a scar, but now, it was a scar I could point to and say, I survived this, and I thrived despite it. They lost their chance to claim me 15 years ago, and their second, greedy attempt failed spectacularly. The hours immediately following the will reading were surreal. Mr. Sterling and I spent the rest of the afternoon at his office, tying up all the loose ends. We filed the acceptance of the estate and started the process of transferring the deeds. I looked at the bank statements, at the sheer, staggering number $5 million. It was impossible to process as mere money. It was trauma insurance. It was a declaration of independence. But the joy was laced with a deep, throbbing sadness for Aunt Clara. She should have been there, celebrating her legacy, celebrating my victory. Instead, it was this cold, clinical exercise in wealth transfer. The anger, however, remained a steady, low burn. It wasn't the volcanic explosion of rage I felt when my parents walked in. It was the deep-seated, righteous resentment that comes from being betrayed by the people who were supposed to be your foundation. I thought about their faces when the color drained, when their entitlement crashed into the legal reality. I inventoried that moment in my mind, replayed it frame by frame. It was the only justice I would ever get from them. They would never apologize. They would never feel the true remorse for the damage they caused. But they did feel the sharp, agonizing pain of having their dream of effortless wealth snatched away in the most public and humiliating way possible. That had to be enough. That had to be the closure I had been seeking for 15 years. I realized that my anger wasn't just about them trying to take the money. It was about them trying to take my narrative. They wanted to rewrite history, to claim the daughter they discarded only after she became valuable. They wanted to make my aunt's kindness their profit. And Mr. Sterling and I, by virtue of Aunt Clara's genius, had stopped them cold. I decided right then that I would use every single cent of that $5 million and every square foot of that big, beautiful house to build a life so safe, so successful, and so entirely mine that their attempt to reclaim me would become nothing more than a ridiculous footnote in my memory. The inventory of the estate was complete, but more importantly, the inventory of my soul was complete. I was finally free. The emancipation papers were the real treasure, more valuable than the $5 million. I stared at the signature of the judge, the neat lettering of the clerk, and the official seal. 5 years ago, I fought for that piece of paper, because I knew, even then, that their shadow loomed. I had to pay for the lawyer myself, scrimping and saving from my part-time jobs while Aunt Clara helped with tuition. It was a quiet, desperate fight for survival, a preemptive strike against the possibility of them ever showing up again. I didn't know when they would return, but the abandoned child in me knew they would eventually follow the scent of blood, or in this case, gold. The pain was not just in being abandoned, but in the constant waiting for them to disappoint me again. The legal emancipation was my declaration of self-ownership, but the scene at the will reading was the emancipation of my soul. When they left the room, they took with them the last vestige of their power over me. They took my 10-year-old fear and the 15 years of resentment, because now, the score was settled. They were utterly powerless. I could finally grieve the childhood I lost without also fearing the future they might try to manipulate. That $5 million became my shield. It became the foundation of the safe, loving, and stable existence that Aunt Clara had worked so hard to build for me. Every single room in the house, every dollar in the bank, was a monument to the woman who chose me and a tombstone for the people who discarded me. The anger became a controlled force, no longer a poison that consumed me, but a protective energy field. I would use that energy to thrive, not just survive. I would be so successful that the news of my life would filter back to them, and every mention of my name would be a dagger in their greedy hearts. They would live knowing they abandoned a millionaire, and that was the perfect, everlasting form of revenge. It's been months since the reading, and the silence from them has been absolute. They haven't called, haven't written, haven't filed any ridiculous motions. Mr. Sterling's threat of civil litigation was enough to send them scurrying back into the shadows they crawled out of. The house is incredible. I wake up every morning in a room that looks out over a beautiful garden, and I think of Aunt Clara. This isn't just property, it's a testament to loyalty. The money is invested wisely, ensuring the future she wanted for me is secure. I've started a foundation in her name, helping other young adults who were abandoned or aged out of the system a final, beautiful middle finger to my parents, demonstrating how real responsibility is handled. The anger is still there, deep down, but it's tempered now by peace. It's no longer a crippling weight. It's the knowledge that I stood up to the two greatest betrayals of my life, the abandonment and the attempted theft, and I won. I beat them with silence, with legal preparation, and with the love of the only family member who mattered. My inheritance wasn't just a big house and $5 million. It was the final, devastating, ironclad declaration that I was valuable, worthy, and loved. And those two people, those monsters, were left with nothing but the humiliating memory of their pale faces and their spectacular failure. They lost me, they lost the money, and they lost the moral high ground forever. I am 25 years old, a homeowner, a millionaire, and most importantly, I am free. And that is the true, priceless victory of the will. I hope this story gives some kind of solace to anyone out there who knows what it feels like to be tossed aside. Remember, the scar will heal, but the truth remains. And justice, sometimes, is delivered on a silver platter wrapped in legal documents.